celebrated worldwide as World Press Freedom Day. It is an opportunity to celebrate the fundamental principles of press freedom, to assess the state of press freedom throughout the world, to defend the media from attacks on their independence, and lastly, to pay tribute to journalists who have lost their lives in the line of duty. Then People, Ms Laura Clark, has been in office as the UK High Commissioner to New Zealand and Governor of the Pitcairn Islands since January 2018. She came here from a senior position in the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and from having been Government Coordinator for India. She has previously undertaken a number of FCO roles in London and abroad. Prior to diplomacy, she worked in the Ministry of Justice, the European Commission and the British Parliament. Mr Nicolas Sabourin is the Acting High Commissioner for Canada and is a diplomat of nearly 20 years standing with service in South America and Europe, and who's been in place in Wellington since 2016. The home team of Media People are represented by three well-known and respected practitioners out of different facets of media. Political editor for News Hub, Tova O'Brien, has been with the News Hub team for a decade, mostly based in Auckland, but also working in Wellington, or the other way around perhaps, as a news and foreign content producer of news and foreign content. Public lawyer Andrew Ladley has for 20 years been steeped in academia, international peace operations and coalition management in the New Zealand government. He's a director of the Institute of Policy Studies in the School of Government at Victoria University of Wellington. Doyen media personality Richard Michael Arthur Harmon has been a front-page media practitioner since the days of Scoop Cullen, the legendary reporter for the New Zealand Truth in the 1960s. At various times in print, with Crackham and the Dominion, and in fields ranging from student politics to agriculture to economics and big politics, and most recently on television, Richard needs little excuse to present defendable viewpoints and opinions, and he certainly earns a place on this morning's billboard. Introductions completed, I now yield you the podium, High Commissioner Clark.
Ina mana, ina reo, ina rangatira, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, katoa. Welcome everyone. Ngā mihi kia koutou. I acknowledge Sir Anand, Sir Lady Susan, all other guests. Thank you very much for coming here today. It is a really important event, as Sir Anand has said, World Press Freedom Day. And it really is an opportunity to reflect, I think, on the fundamental principles of media freedom, the importance of that, and how we need to defend those freedoms from attacks on independence. Because, of course, none of the world's problems, whether climate change, whether conflict, whether improving equality around the world, none of the world's problems can be solved without information that is freely and independently reported. In other words, without quality journalism. And no democracy can flourish without a free press. And of course, these are principles very close to the heart of New Zealand, Canada, and the UK. Yet press freedom globally is in trouble. And if you look at the map of the Reporters Without Borders, Reporters Sans Frontières, that map grows darker each year with problems with press freedom. So that is why the UK and Canada are co-hosting a global conference on media freedom in July this year, and that is why the Canadian High Commission and the British High Commission, together with the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs, are hosting this event this morning. Now I would like now to set the scene a bit more to play a brief video from this year's G7 summit.
The UK, together with Canada, has decided that democratic countries need to stand together to make it an international taboo of the highest order to murder, arrest or detain journalists just for doing their job. And we can only do this if we work together as countries with shared values.
Targeting journalists undermines democracy. It impedes our ability to hold the powerful to account, and it allows countless human rights abuses to take place in the dark. So I welcome the leadership that the UK, along with Canada, is showing by spearheading this new campaign for media freedom. And I'm honoured to be asked to contribute legal proposals on steps that governments can take to improve the protection of journalists by being the chair of a new independent legal panel.
We believe that it's essential for liberal democracies to push back. And those of us who appreciate the absolute importance of liberal democracy need to really start taking some concrete action to defend the open society and to defend liberal democracy.
And with that, I'm going to move location and take my seat here and start moderating and asking the difficult questions and asking the panel to answer those difficult questions. Good. Well, thank you, everyone. And so Anand has introduced our panel, and thank you again to Nicola for sponsoring this event. I'm going to start, you've all been introduced briefly, but I'm going to start with quite a general question, which might allow you to sort of talk a little bit about your own personal experience and connection with the topic as well. And that first question is, what does media freedom mean to you? And I'm going to start with our veteran reporter, Richard.
Well, listening to Sir Anand this morning reminded me that media freedom is a movable feast, that it can mean different things to different people. And I was thinking back on an experience that I had exactly 50 years ago yesterday, when I was the editor of a university capping book, which relied for some of its advice on Sir Anand and his involvement. Unfortunately, it didn't prevent it from being taken to court as an indecent publication. And it's interesting to reflect that the New Zealand legislation in 1969 prohibited the publication of a photograph of a topless woman. Well, now you can see that on any billboard in town. And as recently as March this year, the New Zealand legislation had blasphemous libel still on its books. It was only taken off in March. So we've got to be careful with media freedom, I think, that we don't succumb to the sort of trendy topic of the day. We need to stick to the basics and understand that either we have media freedom or we don't, and that if we try to whittle it away or abridge it or make it the subject of the sort of trendy issue du jour, then we don't have media freedom.
Thank you. Toba.
Yeah, completely agree with Richard in that there are, every journalist probably has a different idea about what press freedom looks like in every country. Definitely very different versions of what press freedom looks like. I have a colleague in the Philippines who has been a journalist for a long time now and runs his own newspaper, but he came into that role accidentally because his uncle, who was who founded the newspaper, had been assassinated, and he wasn't the only member of his family to have been killed for trying to report on corruption. So his version of press freedom is very different to what we have in New Zealand, and we are bloody lucky in New Zealand because we enjoy great freedoms of the press, and for me that's the ability to do my job, to champion the public interest, to hold the government and MPs to account, to listen to New Zealanders, to be able to speak to New Zealanders, to try and explain what's going on in this place to them. And the ability to be able to do that without fear or favour. So I think we are lucky. I think we shouldn't be complacent. I think there's been a few examples of things recently, or when I was in the press gallery the first time around, the teapot tapes happened, and our TV3 officers were raided by police for evidence of the teapot tapes. Winston Peters is suing journalists and accusing them of working for politicians. And this has kind of happened time immemorial, that journalists are questioned, and that's fine, but I also think we shouldn't be complacent. The National Party inquiry recently for me into the Jamie Lee Ross saga, that raised a few questions about journalistic freedoms for me, and there were some, the National Party kind of leaned on me to tell them my source, and also in that kind of subsequent inquiry as well, there were some other things that happened that I thought kind of impinged on that. But overwhelmingly, we are lucky in New Zealand, and we have the freedom to do our job.
Thank you. Nicola, I'll go to you next.
Oh, well, look, I think I'd reflect a lot of the comments that Tova and Richard have made, which is to say that press freedom, the principle of an independent media, a pluralistic media that allows for a range of voices, that without fear or favour can hold governments to account, can hold the powerful to account, is critical to the functioning of a liberal democracy. And I do think that in New Zealand we do a relatively good job of that. And I think it is important on a day like today to take that step back and remember how shocking the state of media freedom is in some parts of the world, that journalists are barred from reporting on government action, that journalists die in their work, for their work, and those things are shocking and are things that it is good to see that there is global action on. Here in New Zealand, when I think about what the challenges for media freedom are, I think the key thing that I would say I've been thinking about is the importance of having that pluralism, that we don't just have one dominant outlet, that we do have different outlets. And the reason that's important is because it allows for different voices to be heard, to be critical of the way that different arms of the media are operating, to take different perspectives on issues. And I'd just put that on the table as an important part of media freedom that we should be protecting.
Thank you. And Andrew?
Could you speak up, please?
Sorry, I'll put the microphone closer to me next time. I apologise.
Fellow hardy breakfasters, one has to be careful how one says that in the company of Brits. I was last in this room with Sir Anand some 12 years ago, and he launched a book, Full Disclosure. The author was my wife, and it was on the Official Information Act. And so it's good to be back. I've been away for a number of years. On the question of what does media freedom mean to me, because I've been working in the mediation field, I tend to look for the questions of what are the limits and how to get agreement to them. I think that, in fact, there are limits to media freedom. There are limits to all freedoms. By definition, freedoms have got limits, and I think what it means for me is to look for the discussions on where those limits are and on how they need to change. And they do, and there are limits to everything, and I distinguish between repressive limits, which will be the focus of much of our discussion, and what I think are reasonable and responsible limits that are, in the words of the Bill of Rights Act, demonstrably justifiable in a free and democratic society. So for me, what media freedom means is that I want to go to the edge and see where the limits are and why are they there, and should we be thinking about them, because I think that's the currency of a modern democracy, is the capacity to keep those conversations going and to keep altering those limits.
Thank you. Very interesting comments for everyone. And I think it leads on the contrast between the significant media freedom in New Zealand. So New Zealand is ranked 7th in the Reporters Without Borders Press Freedom Index. And you talk, Andrew, about being able to push to the edge. Of course, in lots of countries around the world, it doesn't even begin to be possible. And the profession as a whole, particularly globally, faces huge challenges. And last year saw the killing of so-called retaliation journalists, the retaliation killings of journalists nearly double. And so my question then to the panel is what can and should be done to promote media freedom and the safety of journalists around the world where you do not have that freedom to push things to the edge? Shall I come straight back to you, Andrew?
Two things. First, measure, and then second, cooperate. The measure is, I think, important. The Committee to Protect Journalists currently lists 1,340 journalists killed since 1992. And CPJ has created a virtual memorial nicely called The Last Column, which you may have read. Reflecting on the recent Anzac symbolism, one challenge is to somehow feel and measure the consequences of repression. Statistics need to be felt to build a determination to do better. I don't know if there's any physical place that I can visit and feel the engraved names of journalists killed in action, or those languishing in awful prisons, but amongst the imagined gravestones, I touched just 3, and I invite you to do so briefly with me. Did you see Marina Goldovskaya's extraordinary documentary about that vibrant Russian journalist, Anna Politkovskaya? The title was A Bitter Taste of Freedom. In 2006, she was shot at close range in the elevator of her apartment. She'd been reporting on Chechnya. Then Zulhaz Manan, that happy, colourful, extraordinary character, a Bangladeshi LGBT journalist and activist, hacked to death in his home in Dhaka in 2016. What I call an authorising environment had been created in social and other media. And because it's so recent, we're much more likely to remember and to feel the engraving for the horror and loss of Jamal Khashoggi. What characters, what losses. So one challenge, I think, is to measure and remember. The second is to cooperate. Attacks on journalists everywhere affect us all, simply because the world is interconnected. Freedom of the press, like all freedoms, is always provisional. It has to be defended, and I think those clips from the quotes and from the summit of the G7 carry that very well. This has to be defended together. There's no state boundaries to the risks, as the Ides of March showed us here. Our challenge is to join with like-minded others. The UK, as you will have gathered, has appointed Amal Clooney as the Foreign Secretary Special Envoy on this. And there's a lot to say about New Zealand foreign policy and the potential challenges, but the simple word is we have to cooperate. We have to do this tahi together.
Thank you. I'll go to Nicola next.
I think in discussing this topic, I come to the value of social media. And the reason I say that is because when we think about some of these regimes around the world where we do see repression of the press, there are the very visible signs, the horrifying signs that you've just detailed. But there's also, of course, the invisible work that goes on, where states are able to repress the media's ability to report fully and frankly on events through coercion and through pressure, and where that impinges on the ability of a democracy to operate effectively. And what gives me some optimism is that actually what we are seeing with social media, and I'm not just talking about Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, but even the group forums such as WhatsApp and Reddit, is the ability for groups in a democracy to be critical, to surface events that have occurred, to surface points of view that may not be able to find publication in the mainstream media. And the reason I make this point is that I think that at times in this debate, we do get to a polarisation where there's the traditional press versus social media. And I would put on the table that I think social media has been a democratic force, and that it is part actually of how we promote media freedom and protect journalists, because it is often the channel that allows critique of the way journalists are being treated or the media is being expected to operate. And so therefore it is important that we consider that role for social media.
Thank you. Richard.
Well, the points that Nicola's just raised actually go to the heart of the safety issue. If you look on YouTube at the moment, the Leica camera company have got a gripping video which marks the 20th or the 30th anniversary of Tiananmen Square. And it shows the photographers who were in the Beijing hotel filming and photographing what was happening in Tiananmen Square, being chased around the hotel by Chinese police. And it's frightening stuff. And that's the glamorous, romantic vision of journalism that we honour. But the reality is that the very social media that Nicola's talking about are what is one of the biggest threats to the safety of journalists anywhere, because the line between reportage and activism has now been blurred. And if you look, for example, at the journalists that have been killed this year, setting aside those that have been killed in South America, but the others, all to a greater or lesser extent, had an involvement not only as journalists, but also as political activists. And even the unfortunate Mr. Khashoggi, the chap that was chopped up in the embassy in Turkey, was first and foremost a political activist who happened to have a political column in the Washington Post. He was not one of those people in the Beijing hotel running away from the Chinese police because he had a damning photograph of what they were doing in Tiananmen Square. And so I think we do need to address this line between activism and journalism if journalists or reporters are to stay safe.
I might follow on from what Richard was saying and talk a bit about freelance journalists as well, who are disproportionately targeted, I think, in a lot of countries. And I think that there's a lot of media organisations perhaps need to step up and take a bit more of a duty of care for those journalists and for the work that they're contributing to those organisations. So you'll often see a freelance journalist who's putting their lives on the line, and an organisation who's happy to take the work that that person gets, but if they are detained or if something happens to them or their safety is jeopardised, perhaps not coming in. And that's part of the work that the Committee for the Protection of Journalists has been doing a lot of, as well as trying to kind of put the pressure on media organisations like us to make sure that we're offering protections to those freelance journalists if they're contributing to our platforms. And I'd also, just to second what Andrew was saying, just remembering these people, telling their stories, talking about what they were doing and why it was important. Sorry. Talking about their stories and why it was important, and not letting that be forgotten, and also the vast overwhelming majority of the investigations into those murders of those journalists come up with nothing. So there is no culpability. So I think there's also a role of journalists to continue pushing for answers, and for governments as well when travelling to those countries to raise it as an issue.
Thank you. So we've already begun to talk a little bit about the balance between traditional media and social media. And we began by saying how important the Fourth Estate is in upholding democracy and holding powerful figures to account without fear or favour. But I want to now talk a bit about how that has changed since the advent of social media, where, of course, everyone has their own platform. And I'll start with Nicola.
Well, at the risk of being repetitive, I do want to defend social media because sitting here as a politician, I think that social media is a fantastic tool in a democracy. And the reason I would say that is twofold. The first is that it does allow for political voices to communicate directly with their audience without having to be mediated. And that is powerful. Yes, it means that I can tell my supporters what I've been up to and give them my points of view on recent events in a way that Tova may not want to report as headline news on News Hub. But it also means that voices that might otherwise find it very difficult to be heard, that may be marginalised, that may have a small audience, are able to grow that over time. And I think that's very powerful. The second reason that I think social media is important, and certainly the way I see it operating in my work, is that it is a force for community building. It does bring people together in a way that can create movements for change and movements for progress, and I think that has been very positive. I talked to my mother about this. As Richard knows, she was a member of the Press Gallery many years ago. In fact, there's a photo hanging in the corridor of the Press Gallery here, in which my mother is one of a few women in the group, and she's heavily pregnant with me. And she observes that the role of a politician today, as I play it, has changed so much from when she was a journalist in the late 70s here, because we are able to directly tell our supporters what we are doing and what we believe, and we don't need to rely on journalists to get that message out, and that's a very powerful thing. Of course, that does not mean that social media should operate without limits, but I'm sure as a panel we will discuss that more in further questions.
Thank you. Tova.
Turns out Nicola Willis is an honorary member of the Press Gallery as a bump in a photo, and I think it's really exciting that we can use social media in the way that Nicola's saying. I think for politicians to be able to directly communicate with their constituents, I think for journalists who love a good yarn, who love to communicate, the advent and growth of social media was really exciting for us. As a way to a greater marketplace of ideas, to have debates, to be able to share the work that we're doing in different ways. I think it's exciting that we're able to access and publish information in more ways than we have before, but I also think there are now more ways than ever before to spread lies and conspiracy theories and whip up hate, and tragically, as we all know, incite and spread violence. So I think what worries me is that there's this growing perception that what you see and read on social media is illegitimate or accurate as a media representation of an event. We have checks and balances, fairness, accuracy, honesty, and that we need to take into account. And when people read legitimate fake news, I think the head of the GCSB was here recently speaking to MPs and said that disinformation campaigns can affect the levels of trust in media and government. It would most likely impact on domestic debates fueled by distrust of authority and fact. So basically, the more lies there is out there purporting to be fact, the harder it is to get buy-in for actual facts and for legitimate democratic institutions like journalism. And I think that's a dangerous and hugely problematic slippery slope.
Thank you. Andrew.
Yes, I think there is a real question, and which will, I think, link us to other ones that we want to talk about probity and holding media, holding the Fourth Estate, holding government and so on to account, really does become enormously complicated once the media is no longer, if you like, a profession as such, but everyone has access to everything. And I think that does require us, as Richard's point, re-examining these overlaps and links. It is just part of changing technology. I know it requires us to stay on top of that technology. I use an example of that, actually, that I think illustrates this very well, which is the responsibilities that are now on those carriers of these views. And I think that's where one of these cutting edges of our debates is going to be. To illustrate that, I refer you to Carol Cadwalladr's recent TED Talk, TED, TED Talk, in which she basically argued that the social media giants have to take responsibility for their content, not just as being platforms where anyone can say anything. You will know her as one of the journalists that broke the Cambridge Analytica scandal, and which focused on what she calls the biggest electoral fraud in the UK in a century, which is basically geared around the use of disguising the sources of money to influence people in election campaigns, and which, as you know, New Zealand has the same restriction, an attempt to try and put a limit on the amount of money spent in election campaigns. Social media enables that to be completely destroyed. Her TED Talk, basically she calls out the people in the audience by name. It's a very brave talk that includes, as she calls it, the tech titans. And she calls them out, Mark Zuckerberg, Sheryl Sandberg, Larry Page, Sergey Brin, and Jack Dorsey. They're in the audience. And she says, you've broken modern democracy. And the responsibility is to know where information comes from, to have some kind of a capacity to measure its probity. And the public has a right to know that, and you're hiding it. And that's a criminal offense. And she believes, and she says that there's a crime scene going on, particularly in Silicon Valley, and there's responsibilities here. She points to the dark side, I think that Tova was referring to, which is that the social media can amplify what we might call hate speech to create what I called an authorizing environment in which terrible, terrible things can be done. Yes, and the particular example that she refers to in that regard is currently Myanmar, in which social media and Facebook carried these genocidal statements made. There's another wonderful documentary, by the way, called The Venerable W, which tracks the Buddhist monk as he carries out his speech and his process. And when he's shown the documentary and said, look, here's what I did, he said, yep, that's right, that's what I was doing, good piece. When you look at it, it's evidence of crimes against humanity. So I think that there's a darker undertow that she refers to that's in the social media here. And one of our press freedom challenges from March the 15th is about reshaping the limits of who can carry what and what responsibilities there are on the social media. That's a tough conversation. It relates to this cooperation that I think we referred to earlier. I note that the Prime Minister is going to cooperate with the President of France in that regard. It might seem abstract, but I think the issues are deeply practical. Germany has a Network Enforcement Act. There's new legislation proposed in Australia, France, and the UK. A bill has just been introduced in Singapore, the Protection from Online Falsehoods and Manipulation Bill. This, I think, is going to reignite exactly the debate that Richard started us off with, which is that if you seek to limit, you may very well exceed where you should go. But I think that's a conversation that we have to have, especially in a democracy, because of the risks that carries from the social media. It's hard to hold people to account if there's no accountability in the group that are actually carrying the content.
Thank you. Richard?
Well, I agree entirely with Nicola earlier on when she was talking. I mean, the ultimate protection for the freedom of the media is a pluralistic media, and absolutely, and hopefully one that is not dominated by state-owned media. But I think at the end of the day, what we're trying to debate here is the difference between reportage and what we call journalism. Journalism, quite frankly, can be anything, and indeed it is on social media. Reportage, on the other hand, is a much more limited undertaking. And in newsrooms that I've run, I've always had up on the wall the famous lines from Delane, the editor of the Times, which were published, ironically enough, on Waitangi Day in 1852, where the Times said, "The first duty of the press is to obtain the earliest and most correct intelligence of the events of the time, and instantly, by disclosing them, to make them the common property of the nation." Now that's reportage, and that was enlarged on by C.P. Scott when he was editor of The Guardian, with his famous aphorism, where he said, "A newspaper is of necessity something of a monopoly, and its first duty is to shun the temptations of monopoly. Its primary office is the gathering of news. At the peril of its soul, it must see that the supply is not tainted, neither in what it gives, nor in what it does not give, nor in the mode of presentation must the unclouded face of truth suffer wrong. Comment is free, but facts are sacred." That is not an aphorism that is accepted, generally speaking, in social media. Social media is not about reportage. It is by and large about comment. And to that, and therefore, when we talk about limiting social media, we're not limiting media freedom. We're doing no more than limiting what it is possible to say in a public place. Social media, the social media companies say they're not publishers, that they're essentially a post office. And they are, except they're a post office that opens everybody's mail. And to deal with social media is a separate issue to what's happening to reporters and to professional journalists who are reporting for the dreaded mainstream media.
Yeah, very interesting. And that leads me on to my next question. We've talked now about how journalists and the traditional media are very much held to regulations and standards, whereas social media is not at present. And yet, despite that, media has consistently ranked as one of the least trusted professions in the country this century, and that's the same in the UK, it's the same all over the world. So I suppose my question now for the panel, I'll ask Tova first, is how can that trend be bucked? Given that journalists play such an important role, how can we collectively do more to increase public trust in journalists?
I think as journalists we need to ensure that we don't lose sight of who we work for. So we work for New Zealanders, we work for the people. We need to make sure that they're reflected in our newsroom so they see them themselves and they hear their stories told. I think after the Christchurch terror attack there was a lot of soul searching done in newsrooms. Why hadn't we heard those concerns from those communities? Were we not talking enough to those communities? And I think that was quite a hard and shocking realisation for a lot of journalists. So I think we need to make sure that we are more representative of the people that we are working for. And in light of everything that we've said, I think around social media as well, we need to strive harder to be more accurate, more fair, more honest, more independent. When politicians and world leaders attempt to undermine journalism, throwing around the term fake news, we need to work harder to hold them to account. And I think we've seen that in the United States since the election of Donald Trump, just some phenomenal journalism coming out of the US. And so when that happens in New Zealand as well, just this week, one of my stories got called fake news by a senior politician. And firstly, it wasn't. And secondly, we need to call that out because just those seemingly nothing throwaway lines can actually kind of be fairly damaging and potentially quite dangerous, as we've seen in other countries.
Thank you. Richard?
Just a few weeks ago, the University of Missouri's Journalism School reported on a massive project that they've been doing, where they've been doing 1 hour-long interviews with news consumers in the United States. And this is the very question they were asking. It was about trust. And they came with some very interesting conclusions. 77.8% of the people they interviewed, these were unprompted interviews too, said that the single most important thing in evaluating news they were consuming was balance, followed by honesty, depth, and right down at the bottom were the two things that editors prioritise: simplicity and relevance. And relevance was only regarded as being really important by 6% of the people that they interviewed. Last night I was talking to some of the senior management from NZME, who of course have put up their paywall this week. And as somebody who runs a paywall, I could have told them this would happen. They were astonished, it seemed, to discover that what people clicked on and what people paid for were two entirely different things. And it's good news for political reporters. People are paying for political journalism, and so they should, but they're not clicking on the big, outrageous, sensationalist stuff that you see in Stuff or on the Herald website. So get back to that study in Missouri. If journalists and the media operates with integrity and with a seriousness of purpose, the audience and the market will soon pick that up, and this question of trust will, I think, begin to be addressed.
Thank you. Andrew?
I've been astonished at both at the lack of trust and at the polarization that seems to have developed in the last few years, and at the evidence that people want echo chambers rather than serious news. I did my own little straw poll and asked a number of people what was important to them and what were the challenges. And every single person I spoke to, this is about 5, said, we want to be able to trust and to know what we're getting. And that was actually what I was hoping to hear. So I wonder whether I was in my own little echo chamber. But all of the people close to me said that's what we want, and we don't trust a lot of what we see. I think the question of trust is probably closely linked, by the way, they're close competitors. Politicians and the media tend to be kind of racing for the same title in that regard, I'm sorry to say. But I think that the answer as to bucking the trend requires a much more close examination as to why it is that people don't trust them. And I think it probably is something to do with this notion of probity, if we can get it. The contradiction is that people appear to only want stuff to say what they want to hear. And that's, of course, what's made the enormous power of the Cambridge Analytica, is that it can find people who are wavering and can deliver messages only to them, often with absolutely no connection to the truth. Now, I think that if the media is to regain its trust, it does require this continued serious conversation that we're talking about, and in a democracy, about why it is that it seems to be so hard to get sort of public trust expressed, when the things that people want so desperately appear to be trusted commentary and trusted reportage. Thank you.
Thank you. Nicola?
Well, Laura, I hesitate to give advice to one of the least trusted professions when I myself am a member of another least trusted profession. And so I do hesitate in answering this question. But what I do think is that when we look at how people judge the media, we have to accept that in part they can be entirely internally contradictory. You know, the same people who will be very upset at the behaviour of the media for chasing Princess Diana will also be the same, well, I will be the same person who will click very happily on the photo of Harry and Meghan's baby. And so, to some extent, I think when we blame the media for the stories that they cover, we are being slightly anti-democratic and slightly patronising of our audiences, because I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with people having a level of human interest in some of the issues that the media cover. But when I think about what it is that makes the press so important and what people increasingly are searching for in a world that does have multiple forums, channels, places we can go for comment, the thing that I keep coming back to is exactly what Richard started this part of the discussion with, which is the facts. And reporters and journalists have the skills and the networks and the powers to bring us new facts, and the power of investigative reporting to tell stories that would not otherwise be told and to bring together those stories is something that I think I would hope increasingly the media are able to do, because I think that that is what people trust and go to journalists for.
Thank you. Really interesting set of comments. And I'm going to move on now. This question of trust is a big one. The question of can you be confident in what you're reading? And of course, we talked earlier about the distinction between traditional media and journalism and social media, and how social media is a lot more commentary than it is reportage, and that focus on facts and evidence and in which people can be confident. And so then, of course, we come to the big topic, which is very much under debate, which Carol Calwara has been talking about, and of course is a topic of debate in many of our countries, which is, should social media be regulated, and if so, how? And I'm going to go first to our politician.
Well, the first thing I'd say is that social media is regulated. We mustn't get into this binary debate where we discuss whether or not it should have any restrictions on it. There are restrictions on it, you know. I hesitate with such a learned crowd, but let's remember that our Human Rights Act is very specific, and that it bans the use of words which excite hostility against or bring into contempt any group of persons in or who may be coming to New Zealand on the ground of the colour, race or ethnic or national origins of that group of person. And that is where the words are used where they are reasonably likely to be published in a newspaper, magazine, periodical broadcast by means of radio or of television. Or by means of electronic communication. So the reason I make this point is that I think that we sometimes get into a discussion where the social media is somehow a complete Wild West, and actually defaming people on social media or using social media to incite violence is not allowed. So it's important to put that on the table. Then when it comes to questions of how it should be regulated further, I think the next question is always how you affect that, because I don't think that any of us in this room think it is acceptable that a live video of the Christchurch massacre was able to be multiply published around the world. That is anathema to me. But the question is, how do we stop that? And not only in terms of the technical ability to stop that, but also the very nature of social media is that it is not ruled by one government. It is global. And wherever there is a government that has a more repressive regime in one jurisdiction, you can be sure that another platform will evolve in another. If Facebook becomes the place where lives can't happen, well, you bet there'll be a new market for a new platform that is able to do that. So we need to think very practically about how we affect these changes, given the global multi-platform nature of social media. So I'll leave it there.
Andrew.
Yes, I think that Richard put his finger on when he said that there's a difference between being a platform that carries something, and that sense allows the expression of views and reportage. My short answer is that I think that yes, it should be regulated. The real question is that debate that we're right in now, which is how. And I think that there's enough evidence of the risks to make it very clear that if you don't limit them, there can be this dark undertow if you don't regulate. There's enough evidence equally that repressive societies desperately want to regulate and will turn off the social media extremely quickly. I think that on this balance, a good example recently which shows the different views was after the terrible, terrible massacres in Sri Lanka just a few days ago, where the government turned off the social media. And in that case, they didn't do it, as in Zimbabwe and a few other places, in order to control what people were saying about the government. They did it because they said that the risks were that there would be amplification of the terrible fear, and that there would be retaliation killings. And quite a few commentators, including ones who are very strongly against any restrictions on the media, came out and said, actually, that was probably right. It was a good call. It slowed down the capacity of social media to spread rumor and other things, and it probably stopped building this authorizing environment in which some people were simply going to go and kill others. Now, I'm not at this stage taking a clear position, and I'm just simply telling you that that was the debate. I do think that PEN America has cited that one of the senior employees from Twitter is saying it would be relatively easy to put in an algorithm, is the word I was looking for, which would go after racist propaganda. The trouble is that it would catch many current politicians, said the person, and hence that then instantly gets you into this question of where are those limits. That's a current debate. I think it's a crucial debate. I think that there is responsibility for creating what I call an authorizing environment in which you think that you are simply baiting up the public debate in order to get votes. but actually somewhere down the line somebody's going to get killed and or attacked or threatened. And I think that social media carries a responsibility for that, and I'm with Carol Cadwallader.
Thank you. Tova.
Thank you. Yeah, I think something's got to give in no country and no planet. Is it okay for a child to be able to tap onto their Facebook and a video starts auto-playing of a terrorist massacre? So something has to give, and that's obviously at the extreme end. We've seen the weaponising of social media and the things that we were talking about earlier in terms of spreading disinformation, whipping up hate. So something's got to give, but there needs to be a balance with civil liberties, and as Andrew's saying as well, if every country is determining these regulations, we run into the risk that countries determine the rules, and some of those countries it's going to be in their interests to kibosh the freedom of expression that social media affords. Mark Zuckerberg, when he did his big speech this week, kind of big set piece about the future of Facebook, talking about the future being private, and that's where Facebook is heading, so more into kind of enclosed groups with end-to-end encryption. I was hoping that there might be something more in that speech that talked about an extension of the self-regulation that social media does, but I think this is going to throw up a whole new set of problems. The privacy commissioners raised concerns about those things that we're talking about in terms of whipping up hate and inciting violence, now going into closed groups, so those groups of people are able to hide and kind of better serve nefarious ends, if you like. So I think we need to evolve with it. I like the idea of a concerted international approach, how that would work. I mean, yet to be determined, but it will be interesting to see what comes out of Paris, and hopefully it's not just a hui with no doui.
Thank
Winston.
you. Richard.
Tova, channeling Winston Peters there.
It's never been said before.
Just a point, Nicola, about the Human Rights Act. Yes, the Act does contain the offence of inciting racial or ethnic hatred. There has unfortunately been only one prosecution, as I understand it, since 1993 when the legislation was passed. And the reason for that is because the Human Rights Commission takes their role as being to mediate situations that are brought to their attention. But I think there's some room for some action there, and the Act also needs amending to include discrimination against religion as well, and that would embrace Christians, Jews and Muslims overnight. The problem with regulating social media is, I think, quite graphically displayed by the Christchurch video. And the proposal that I understand they're taking to Paris is that they're going to try and regulate terrorist material on social media. The problem with that is that one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. And who is going to decide who is a terrorist? We have an interesting situation on live video. So we're going to ban terrorist statements, but we're going to allow the New Zealand Prime Minister's press conference each week to be broadcast live on Facebook, which it is. Now, who's going to make these decisions? Are states going to decide who can appear on social media and who can't? The only thing I will say is that it hasn't got a hell of a lot to do with the freedom of the media. It's more about it's a freedom of speech issue. Back down here in our newsrooms, we have got to stick to the basics and stick to those admonitions that came from the Times and the Guardian about being reporters, and leave the shouting and yelling and debating and proclaiming to social media, and hope that the civil society and governments can somehow something about phones in your introduction there, Sir Arnold.
Irresistible.
And I think we as the media need to stay out of this debate. We've got to preserve our corner of the universe, and inciting hatred and all that sort of thing is a much broader conversation which involves the whole community, but it shouldn't be seen as some sort of thing that's aimed at the media. I think the media have got to stick to their knitting and stay out of this one, frankly.
Thank you, and we've been incredibly disciplined timing-wise. I'm quite impressed by all of us. So I'm just going to do a bonus question for the audience. I'm going to ask each of my panel members if they choose to answer. Thinking ahead to this gathering, this global conference on media freedom later this year, if you were to leave all those global leaders with one thing that needs to change, what would that be? And you can volunteer your order. I'm not even going to dictate that.
We focused on lies in the social media, but not those in MSM. I want to point out the brazen hypocrisy of World Press Freedom Day being hosted by the UK government at this dark time. Julian Assange is being persecuted by war criminals, and the corrupt that he exposed are still sitting in positions of power in the government on both sides of the aisle, as well as in much of the media. Imagine the precedent Trump is setting, that any country could extradite any foreign journalist or publisher and make them subject to draconian laws, possibly the death penalty, just because they publish truth about the government's war crimes. Imagine if that state was Saudi Arabia. We call on the world media to stand by their award-winning colleague and Nobel Peace Prize nominee. End the smears and lies about an anti-war hero. You want to know how to get people trusting media more? Tell the truth. Stop delivering a one-sided, sanctioned, government-sanctioned narrative. That is what is going on here.
Thank you for your statement. I mean, I would just say that the Julian Assange issue is about him being held to account and to justice, and it's not, I would say, a media freedom issue, but thank you for your statement.
Well, the Guardian has done quite a lot on this question of whether he's a journalist or not, and has concluded that he's not.
So, thank you. Sorry, we're not really having. Thank you. That's fine. Any further? We are talking about, but this is also a panel discussion. Any further comments from my panelists?
Yeah, look, I've got an idea that I would like to see at least considered. One of the biggest constraints on media freedom internationally is the ability to get in and out of countries. And I wonder whether there isn't a case for the United Nations or an international organisation to develop an international media visa. Something like the carnet that is used to move television equipment across borders. Because it is actually, in a practical terms, at an international level, a real obstacle. And there are jurisdictions within our own region, in fact our nearest neighbour, who controls who comes in and out of their country quite vigorously. And it would be great to have something that would enable you to hurdle past customs, past immigration.
I like the concept, but Richard, I worry that it would become a target on the back of the person who had that visa from time to time in some regimes.
If you're doing a job, the target's there anyway.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. I'm now going to hand over to Nicola, Acting High Commissioner for Canada. Thank you.
So good morning, bonjour, kia ora. Thank you, High Commissioner Clark, to you and your team, and to our friends of NZIA, Sir Anand, for co-hosting the event. And special thanks also to our panelists for engaging in such a wide-ranging conversation on this important topic. You've given us all food for thought this morning. If I may, I think two elements I take out of this discussion would be the following. On the one hand, as we've seen just now and throughout the discussion, I think what Andrew said about setting limits is very topical. And I'm not only talking about limits on media freedom, but limits on actually all the concepts that we're talking about. Where does media freedom morph into freedom of press, freedom of expression? Where does journalism become comment? When does a publisher becomes a journalist? When does a publisher is just a leaker? all those concepts are very fluid, and depending on what is our starting point on those concepts, we can go in totally different directions. And I think that one of the great challenges for all the events that are coming down this year, both in Paris and in London, will be actually to find common ground on what those concepts mean, because otherwise we won't be able to develop shared objectives and shared views on what we're trying to achieve. The second point is that I was very pleased actually to see how the discussion to a large extent was about problems that affect us here in New Zealand, in Canada, and in the UK, in Western democracies in general. Quite often and traditionally we would think of media freedom as an issue for developing countries, but we see that there are dimensions that actually have a lot of relevance for us as we deal with the aftermath of the terrible events in Christchurch, as we approach elections in Canada later this year, in New Zealand next year. So thank you for raising those issues, and I'm sure that will be just the start of a discussion among ourselves here as we end the event. So I'd like to reiterate Canada's support for media freedom and the essential role that our fourth estate plays in defending and advancing the truth. We've seen the alarming statistics from the Committee to Protect Journalists that show that journalists face growing risks around the world as they endeavor to report facts freely and independently. So these emerging threats and number of issues canvassed by a panel today provided the impetus for Canada's decision to co-host the first global conference for media freedom with the United Kingdom in London, and that will be on July 10th to 11th. You might know that our Foreign Minister, Chrystia Freeland, was herself a journalist by training and has been a vocal advocate for the protection of media professionals and the promotion of freedom of opinion. And I know that the UK and New Zealand as well share Canada's confidence that conference will offer effective ways to address these threats to press freedom and to the integrity of the global information space. So we look forward to hosting a follow-up event in Canada next year. So finally, thanks to all of you for your attendance and participation today. I have to say I'm quite impressed by the turnout and at such an early time of day on a Friday. On this 26th World Press Freedom Day, let us commit to doing our part to raise awareness of the importance of freedom of the press and freedom of expression. Thank you. Merci. Kia ora.
Thank you.